Okay, let's discuss our sociological theories, or some people will call them frameworks, some people call them paradigms. For our class or for our purposes, we will stick with the term theories. There are 6 broad theoretical paradigms or theories in sociology. However, we're only going to discuss 4 of them. And actually, throughout the semester, we'll pretty much focus on 3: functionalism, conflict theory, and symbolic interactionism. We will look at feminist theory, but that'll be when we get into our chapter on sex, gender, and sexuality. Okay. In most of these theories, we see the influence of early social theorists as others expand upon their views or offer alternate explanations. Functionalism interprets each part of society in terms of how it contributes to the stability of the whole. It's the idea of how does each part within society, for example, we're going to discuss culture. And so we'll talk about how culture contributes to the stability of the whole of society. Same thing when we talk about deviance. We'll talk about how deviance contributes to the whole of society. So each one of our topics, each one of our topics like culture, deviance, sex, sexuality, race and ethnicity, we will talk about aspects and how each one of those aspects contribute to the whole of the society. So that's the way functionalism looks at things. And it's looking at this aspect of stability within society. The classical theorists who are the founders of this framework were Auguste Comte and Emile Durkheim. But Emile Durkheim is really seen as the father of functionalism. One way to understand functionalism is to think of the body. The body is made up of different parts such as the skeletal, musculatory, organs, skin, and fluids that each carry out a different function. The parts must work together to sustain the body. When something wrong happens in one part, the other part reacts in order to restore order. According to functionalists, society is like the body. It is made up of different parts or social institutions, right? Such as religion, such as work in the economy, the political and state, healthcare, the family, education, social media, sports. All of those are considered social institutions. They serve a different function and they play different roles in order to create social order. They also help for us to maintain society as a whole. Functionalism was extremely popular in the 1950s, and one of the most important contemporary theorists was a man named Tal Clark Parsons. He viewed all of the social systems as interrelated, with different parts of society having basic functions. Another contemporary theorist, his name is Robert Merton. Some of the theories that he talks about are going to be used by criminologists, and we'll actually discuss one of his theories, Merton's strain theory, when we talk about when we get into our chapter on deviance and crime. Merton understood that human behavior had both manifest, and those are going to be functions that you know about, the functions that we kind of take an account for, and latent functions. And latent functions are going to be functions that are hidden. They're not intended. So manifest functions are stated and intended goals of social behavior, while latent functions are neither stated nor are they intended functions. Functionalism has been criticized for placing too much emphasis on order and too little emphasis on conflict in society. So that's one of the major critiques of functionalism. Functionalism also doesn't really look at inequality. That's not a major part of it, but it's looking at how everything contributes to maintain this stability. Even when things are dysfunctional within a society, you see where another part of society will kind of compensate for that dysfunction in order to maintain that stability. Conflict theory, now we'll move on to conflict theory. And the founding fathers of conflict theory are Karl Marx and Max Weber, but really Marx is seen as the father of conflict theory. But conflict theory sees society as organized around unequal distributions of resources and held together through power and coercion. Marx studied how powerful individuals and groups in society promote their interests and how those without power try to acquire it. Powerful individuals and groups use whatever means necessary to hold on to their power, such as through direct use of force, the enactment of laws and rules that favor them, and almost through the development of ideas or ideology that justify their actions and positions in society. Ideology is the idea that, or the definition of ideology is basically the way to justify the status quo, okay? Or to maintain the way things are operating within society. Many Marxian sociologists maintain that the dual identity of both maintain an idea of both theorist and political reformer, because they're always, typically conflict theorists are always trying to look kind of for social justice, are always looking for ways to change society to make it more equal. Conflict theory has been neglected or has been criticized for neglecting the importance of shared values and public consensus in society. So one of the things with conflict theory is that it has been criticized because it doesn't look at the idea of shared values within society. Okay. Symbolic interaction theory is actually more of a contemporary theory. It emphasizes the role of the individuals in giving meaning to social behavior, thereby creating society. We evaluate the complex and subtle clues on how we observe our interactions with others to determine what we should say, how we should act, and what we should think. Since our interactions with others are ongoing, our sense of self is constantly changing. We understand that certain symbols mean or represent different things. So it is the idea of what do these symbols mean to the individual. Forgot to mention before that when we're looking at functionalism and conflict theory, they are seen as macro sociology because it's looking at society on a whole. It doesn't look at individuals within society. Micro sociology would be symbolic interactionism because it looks at society or looks at individuals within society. Feminist theory is the analysis of women and men in a society and is intended to improve the lives of women and men. There's different schools of thought with feminist theory because one of them is looking directly at women's lives, but then you have another school of thought with feminist theory that is looking at the oppression of all groups, and it's the idea of how to improve the lives of those who are being oppressed. There are different areas of feminism. Liberal feminism has its roots in the first waves of the women's movement. The goal here was to get women the right to vote. It was the idea that if women had the right to vote, they could start changing policies to do things gradually. More women could be elected into office, thus laws would be created for women in mind, and women would have an input within that. The second wave of feminism saw radical feminists, which has its roots in conflict theory. It uses the model of capitalism, and women were seen as proletariats and men were seen as the bourgeoisies. Radical feminism is the idea of dismantling the whole system. The social institutions favor men, and even though, like liberal feminists, even though they don't want to work within the system like liberal feminists, radical feminists want to dismantle the system because they already see it as biased. And feminist theory is also seen as a macro sociology. So micro sociologies are theories that focus on face-to-face social interactions like symbolic interaction does. This would be symbolic interaction because it examines the way people interact with others, the process of that interaction, and understanding what interaction means. This idea, microsociology, comes from the Chicago School. Macro, on the other hand, these are theories that focus on the whole of society. Conflict and functionalism and feminist theory would be considered macro sociology because it does not focus on individual actions, but it focuses on the whole of society. So this chart actually provides you with some major criticisms of the sociological framework. So one of the major criticisms of functionalism is that it focuses only on stability and it ignores inequalities of social class, race, and gender. Conflict theory has its weaknesses because it ignores social unity based on mutual interdependence and shared values. Because it is extremely political, it cannot claim scientific objectivity. It envisions society in terms of broad abstractions, as macro sociology would do. Symbolic interactionism, one of the criticisms from this is that it's seen as very unique, and it risks overlooking the effects of culture, class, gender, and race. So each one of these theories has major criticisms, and a lot of the criticisms for these theories are going to be what the other theories are going to look at. Okay. So let's apply these theories to the sociology of sports. So the function of sports, which would be functionalism, looks at how sports help society function smoothly. A manifest function or a known function of sports would include providing recreation, a means of getting into physical shape, relatively harmless way of letting off steam. A latent function or underlying function, or something that wasn't accounted for, would be the jobs that sports has created. Sports has created thousands of jobs, from those who are working in the gym, to those who are sports trainers, to those who are sports agents, to those who are the players, to those who are cleaning up the arena. So it has created thousands of jobs. So that would be seen as, okay, this is a function and this is how it contributes to the whole of society. Another thing with sports is it builds social relationships. Another thing too with sports is that it also maybe contributes to particular work ethics that sports figures may have. So sports and conflict, the links between sports and social inequality. Historically, sports have benefited men more than women. Some sports are accessible mainly to affluent people. For example, people who play polo, maybe people who play lacrosse. At one time, golf might have been seen that way, and it still might be seen that way considering how expensive the clubs and that type of thing are, as opposed to persons who play basketball, football, and baseball, because typically with that, all you kind of need is a ball and maybe a stick or a bat, and it's a little bit easier. We can see that racial discrimination exists in professional sports too. There was a study that was done and it focused on baseball. And one of the things it showed was the lack of pitchers of color, because that was seen as a thinking position as opposed to those who were in the outfield. And you have more people of color that were in the outfield at the time that this study was done, because that's not necessarily seen as a thinking position. Sports as interaction. This would be with symbolic interactionism, and it looks at the different meanings and understandings people have of sports. Within a team, players affect each other's understanding of sports. Some people, the way that they interpret or understand sports is that they like healthy competition. Some people will look at sports as for camaraderie, that they enjoy hanging out with others. And the reaction of the public can also affect how players perceive their sports. For example, we may think of how, like in our society, right, soccer at one particular time was not seen as a sport that drew in a lot of people. So players may view that as being a soccer player here may be seen as, maybe seen kind of lower on the totem pole in compared to football, basketball, or baseball.